among the shadows, you wipe my tears away. And I felt the pain of heartbreak, and I've seen the brighter days. And I break breast to heaven from my lowest place. And I have held your blessings, God, you give and take away. No matter what I have, your grace is enough. No matter where I am, I'm standing in your love. On the mountains I will bow my life to the one who set me there. In the valley I will lift my eyes to the one who sees me there. When I'm standing on the mountain, I didn't get there on my own. When I'm walking through the valley, I know I am not alone. You're God of the hills and valleys, hills and valleys, God of the hills and valleys, and I am not alone. I've watched my dreams get broken. In you I hope again. No matter what, I know I'm safe inside your hand. On the mountains I will bow my life to the one who set me there. In the valley I will lift my eyes to the one who sees me there. When I'm standing on the mountain, I didn't get there on my own. When I'm walking through the valley, I know I am not alone. You're God of the hills and valleys, hills and valleys, God of the hills and valleys, and I am not alone. Father, you give and take away every joy and every pain. Through it all you will remain, over it all. Father, you give and take away every joy and every pain. Through it all you will remain, over it all. On the mountains I will bow my life, yeah. In the valley I will lift my eyes, yeah. On the mountains I will bow my life to the one who set me there. In the valley I will lift my eyes to the one who sees me there. When I'm standing on the mountain, I didn't get there on my own. When I'm walking through the valley, I know I am not alone. You're God of the hills and valleys, hills and valleys, God of the hills and the valleys, and I am not alone. You're God of the hills and valleys, hills and valleys, God of the hills and the valleys, and I am not alone. God of the valleys, and I will choose to say, blessed be your name, yeah, yeah. And I am not alone.
That's a great song, and that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at the God of the hills and the valleys. Also, in my head, that's how I sing. Reality is not very, very different, however. I love that song because we're going to look at the life of Elijah today. And we asked for some topics, and we only got a few thrown out there. And most of the topics people recommended for Labor Day weekend fit better in a series. So we're going to look at Elijah. We went through some Old Testament prophets before, and we didn't quite get to him, but I love Elijah. And here's why I love Elijah so much is because I can relate to Elijah. And I think today you're going to see that you can relate to Elijah because there is no greater example of the hills and the valleys than Elijah. One of the things I love about him, though, is actually how he starts off. If you have your Bibles with you today, we're going to be in 1 Kings 17 through 19 a lot. That's where we're going to be at most of the day. So feel free to jump in there. It's in the handout as well, and it's going to be on the screen. But I love how Elijah starts. Check this out. 1 Kings 17:1. It just says this. Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. Elijah gets no introduction. There is no start. He just shows up on the scene, and the first thing he does is he tells this king that things are going to be bad. He just shows up in there, and you might not think that's a big deal unless you know who Ahab is. Let's turn back to 1 Kings 16. At the end of it, it says this: Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. That's a lot. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than did all the kings of Israel before him. So Elijah shows up on the scene, and he has to tell this evil, wicked king this bad news. I mean, Ahab is worse than Osama bin Laden, Hitler, and Kim Jong-un all mixed together, all right? That's who Ahab is. He is the worst of the worst when it comes to kings. And Elijah has to say to him, there's going to be a drought. You're not going to have food. You're not going to be very happy. And that is a difficult way to start. That's the first thing we see from Elijah. He has to get into these problems with this crazy king. And Elijah definitely had many types of struggles, and they started on day one. And we can learn a lot from Elijah because he was at the top of the mountain and he was in the valley, and that happened with a short time span. And so we're going to see that from Elijah's life today. But the first thing we see about Elijah is this: that Elijah understood God's provision. So he promised that there was going to be a drought. There's no water, so there's not going to be very much food. And God says to Elijah, tell that to Ahab, and then go out into the desert, and I will provide for you. So 1 Kings 17:2 says this: Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there. So he did what the Lord had told him. He went to the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan, and stayed there. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. Now, here's the thing about when God provides. Sometimes it's not exactly what we imagined. When I read this, this is the picture that came to my mind right here of Elijah with the ravens. Now, I know that's not probably how it worked, all right? But I'm thinking to myself, Elijah says, I'm following you, God, and I don't know that I want bird food. I don't know that I want birds dropping off my food. God says, I provided. And Elijah, this is not what I imagined when I thought you would provide. God goes, I've got you. I will take care of you. But the one thing that's clear from this is that to get through the valleys of life, we have to understand God's provision. We have to understand God's provision, that God will provide, and even it's not exactly the way we imagine, God still provides. Well, we see that again when the brook dries up. Here's what happens. So he's out there. Remember, it's a drought, and the brook dries up, and so now he's got to go find some food. And he's got to go find some water, and so he goes into a town in 1 Kings 17:7. It says, the word of the Lord came to him, and go to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there, and I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. So he went to Zarephath, and when he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks, and he called to her and said, would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink? And she was going to get it. He called, and bring me, please, a piece of bread. I love this. I love this thing. He says, hey, bring me some bread also. Now remember, there's a drought here. There is no food. And so she was going to get him a little bit of water, but he says this, and she kind of snaps at him and says this back to him. He says, as surely as the Lord your God lives, she replied, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I imagine she is yelling at this point, and her hands are doing this. Have you ever been so angry you don't know what to do, but your hands are just going all over the place because you're trying to make your point and you think doing that's going to make it better? I mean, my kids probably see that and go, what's wrong with your arms? It's because you won't listen. That is what this lady is doing. She's like, I have no food. We are in a drought. She says, as surely as the Lord your God lives. She's saying, holy cow, you don't understand. She says this, I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son that we may eat it and die. We have no food. We are going to die. It's interesting to me. At the beginning of this little section, it says God directed a widow to help him with his food. I don't understand how God directed her in all of this. But you see, God provides, so we'll see here in just a second. Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. I imagine Elijah saying, don't be afraid is the same whenever you say to your spouse, calm down. You know how well that goes. And that's what Elijah does here. Calm down. He says, but first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. So she went away and did as Elijah told her. You see, God had prepared her. God had prepared her. Elijah had to do his part, but God had it all ready for what was going to happen. Her heart was ready. And so she went away and did as he said. And so there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. Now, I am sure that this lady believed in God. I am sure she believed this lady believed in God. But this dude who comes down from the mountains, he's probably all scraggly, more than likely pretty smelly because there hasn't been a lot of water. And he says to her, you know what? Make the last piece of bread you have and give it to me. Not your son, not yourself. Don't eat it. Give it to me. For her to do that, God is clearly providing. God has already been working ahead, and God does that for us. He works ahead knowing what we will need already, and sometimes we don't even see that. And she was already there, ready to provide what Elijah needed, and God knew it. God had it all planned out. He knew that even when someone was at the end of their rope, that God would sustain them. Elijah understood that. He understood what God was doing in this situation. He understood God's provision. And for us to get through the difficult times, and then for us to help others get through those difficult times, we have to understand God's provision. I don't know about you, but I have so many times that I know God provided because there was no other answer. There was just no other answer except for the fact that God provided. And Elijah understood God's provision. And because Elijah understood God's provision, Elijah then was ready and able to step out for God. When we know that God has us, it's easy to step out. Next week, we're going to start a series that I'm pretty excited about. We're hoping we're going to get some things worked out so we can do some cool illustrations in here, but it's called Faith Over Fear. And when we know that God will provide and that God takes care of us, we can step out for God. And Elijah was willing to do that. He was willing to go out on a limb for God. And we see Elijah having faith in these difficult circumstances. It's a classic confrontation, 1 Kings 18. It says this. So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. When he saw Elijah, he said to him, is that you troubler of Israel? I have not made trouble for Israel, Elijah replied, but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. You see, Ahab wanted to make it about Elijah being the problem instead of all the sins that he had committed and all the things that he had done. And honestly, we see that all the time. Have you ever been doing something that you know is right and somebody said, no, you're the problem? We see that in our society today. Oh, Christians, you're so close-minded, you're so bigoted. No, we're doing what's right because this is what God has said. Elijah says, no, I'm doing what God has called me to do. You are the problem, and you just don't like it. I'm not the problem here. And so because of this confrontation between Ahab and Elijah, we have the throwdown on the mountain. So when I was a kid, this may have been hard to believe. I was kind of a mouthy little kid sometimes. And I was not big enough to back it up. And so when I was at school, and this throwdown on the mountain kind of reminds me of this. Did you ever tell another kid, hey, I'm going to meet you after school? Let's meet after school, behind the school. That way nobody gets in trouble. And there's about a 90% chance nobody's showing up. Meet you behind school. I did that once when I was a kid. This kid said, hey, I'm going to meet you after school. I said, all right, I'll meet you after school. Luckily, I lived near the school, and so after school, I showed up at the designated fight place. And I showed up to meet this kid after school. I have never been more thankful that the kid didn't show up. He would have killed me. Of course, I wasn't smart enough to keep my mouth shut, and the next day at school, I'm like, yeah, why didn't you show up? And that caused some more problems. But anyway, this throwdown on the mountain is getting ready to be Elijah to Ahab, and he says, I'm going to meet you after school. We're going to fight, and we're going to make this go down. And that's what we see right here on the mountain. Elijah says this in verse 19. Summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel. That's what we're going to meet. This is where this throwdown's happening. And bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel, assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people and said, how long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. But the people said nothing. You realize they didn't even understand who God was anymore. They were so far away from what God wanted them to do, they didn't even recognize God. Man, it sounds like the society we live in sometimes. They don't even recognize when God is talking, when God is pushing for a direction. They didn't say anything. The people didn't even want to stand up for God. They still couldn't decide. And so it's Elijah versus 450 plus another 400 prophets. 1 versus 850. I'm from Oklahoma. I took my shoes off to do that math. He is going against all of them by himself. He says, all right, let's see what happens. Let's see if this is a fair fight. Elijah said to them, I'm the only one of the Lord's prophets left, and Baal has 450. He says, get 2 bulls and cut them up, and you make an altar, and you pray to your God and see what happens. Let's see if he burns up the sacrifice. And so the prophets of Baal, they cut up the stuff, they make an altar, they put it on there, and they are dancing around. This is in the morning they start, and they are dancing and screaming. It literally says they are cutting themselves. I imagine Elijah is laying on the side on the ground with his hands behind his head, just kind of chilling, just kind of watching. And about noon, the Bible says, he starts asking them, where is your God? Where is this God of yours? Where is Baal? He actually says this. He says, he told him not to light the fire. And he says this. He says, shout louder, he said. Surely he is a God. Perhaps he is deep in thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened. Actually, here's the funny part. If you look at the Hebrew, what Elijah actually is kind of saying is, he might be in the potty. Your God might be going to the bathroom. That is why he cannot answer you. Which I love that, because I don't know about you, but that's like the only quiet place in our house, so I totally get what he's saying. Like, I understand. So maybe your God can't hear you because he's in the bathroom and you just need to shout louder. So they continue to do this. They shout and they slash themselves and they're cutting, and midday has passed, and they continue all this. And Elijah's like, all right, it's go time. This is how it's done. Verse 30. Elijah said to all the people, all right, come over here to me. I can only imagine this scene. They're all watching these guys doing all Elijah. All right, it's go time. Come over here. This is how it's done. Come watch. He says, they came to him and he repaired the altar of the Lord which had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones, 1 for each of the 12 tribes, and he built the altar. And then it says they built a trench around the altar. And what they did was, he said, put the bulls on top, cut it up into pieces and put it on top, and then we're going to dump water on the altar. We're going to do, I don't know about you, but when you're going to build a fire, normally you don't put water on it. And he says, no, watch this. So they dump water and it fills the trenches. Jug after jug after jug of water is on top of the rocks and the wood and all of this. And he says this to them. He says, he stepped forward and he prayed. He says, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. And then check this out. The fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. I've not seen a fire hot enough to burn up stones like that. It's gone. Fire comes down, boom, and it's gone. I was a youth minister for a long, long time and been in a lot of camps. One of our favorite campfire stories was Elijah. And we did this one time. So we took a wire, and you may have heard this before, other people have done this, took a wire and ran from a tree down to the fireplace. And we took a roll of toilet paper that we had doused in gasoline up at the top. And as we're teaching, we're talking about this, but instead of water, we dumped gasoline onto the fire that we built this altar. This sounds like a great idea at first. And so we light the toilet paper and we send it down and it hits into the thing, like the fire of God coming down. It hits the thing. Now, none of us were necessarily, chemists or rocket scientists. We used a lot of gas. So as I'm up there speaking, I feel a fireball behind me. The person in the front row, some of their eyebrows got burned off. And it was a lesson the kids will never forget and we will never do again. But I was thinking to myself, that is just a small example of what God did. He burned the rocks and they all disappeared. God showed he was God. And then this is what happens. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, he is God, the Lord, he is God." Then Elijah commanded, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let anyone get away." They seized them, and Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there. It seemed like it was Elijah versus the world. And if I was Elijah, I'd probably be doing the Rocky. Walking around with my hands up, took them all out. Took them all out. And that's what it seems like here. And under Elijah, because he knew God's provision, he understood what it meant to stand strong. You see, and we can stand strong for God when we understand God's provision. But here's what happened next. Elijah goes from understanding God's provision in this mountaintop experience, both literally and figuratively. He's on top. He's like, I'm number one. You've got the music playing in the background. He's running up and down the mountain, like Rocky. And he's doing all this. And then the very next thing we see is this. He's in a valley. I don't know about you, but in my life, sometimes the hardest moments come after the greatest victories. And we think we're on top of the mountain and everything is great. And then all of a sudden, Satan decides to attack us. And we have these problems. We have these struggles. And we're like, where did this come from? Everything was so good. You see, Elijah fell from the mountaintop to the valley. 1 Kings 19. We finished up in 18 and now here's 19. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." Basically, what Jezebel was saying is, you're going to be dead, and I'm going to kill you. Ahab was bad. Jezebel was worse. I mean, we literally name a woman who is a really bad woman Jezebel. We've taken her name to mean somebody really evil and bad. That's how bad she was. So now Elijah has these evil, powerful people after him, and I'm sure he thought that after the prophets of Baal were gone and God showed his power, everything would be great. But that's not the case. Now his problems have just gotten worse. He's on this mountain and we won, God. Yay, great job. And now somebody's after him, ready to kill him. Verse 3 says this. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. Wait a second, I thought Elijah believed in God's provision. And when he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. Man, I read about Elijah and I think to myself, his faith kind of does this. And then I think to myself, man, that's why I can relate to Elijah. Some days it's strong and I'm on a mountain and everything is good and everything is awesome. And then the next day, I'm in a valley and I'm thinking, oh God, it's just too hard. I can't do this. Why is this happening to me? And I don't know about you, but sometimes I begin to think that God is with me when I'm on the mountain, but when I'm in the valley, he's left. That's why I like that song so much. He's the God of the hills and the valleys. He's the one that whenever we're at the mountaintop, God's put us there. And when we're in the valleys, he sees us there. And Elijah is doing that exact same thing that we do in our life, this up and down. And I can relate. The feeling of hopelessness, even though we know God provides. We know God provides, but we still might feel hopeless sometimes. This is what happens. All at once, an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and then lay down again. A famous preacher once said this. He said, I love the story of Elijah because basically God is telling us, sometimes all you need to do is get something to eat and take a nap and things will be better. He is exactly right. It is amazing how often we just need to get something to eat and take a nap and things seem to be a lot better. I mean, they even have a phrase for it. It's called hangry. We're hangry. And that's what happens here with Elijah. Then verse 7. Then the angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, all right, get up from your nap, get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. So he got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by the food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night. Oh man, Elijah's up here and he's down here. And now he just traveled for 40 days to get to where God wanted him to be. He is back up again. And after his dark place, God had amazing plans for him as well. And that is all because of God's provision. And we're a lot like Elijah. We are a lot like Elijah. And all too often, we see that right after our biggest victories come the toughest times. But here's the thing. God will provide in the valleys. God will provide in the valley. And it may not be exactly what we think it should be, but God is the God of the mountain, and God is the God of the valley, and he will make a way. I mean, Elijah was ready to just say, I'm done, God. I'm ready to go. I'm ready to die. And yes, I know. I saw what you did on that mountain. I know you've taken care of me in the past. But right now, I'm done. Right now, I can't take any more. He felt alone. He felt like his life was in danger. He felt like he had nothing. But here's what Elijah did have. He had God. He had God. And he had a God that was there in the good times and in the bad. And when Elijah understood God's provision in both those times, he could fulfill the mission God had for him. And I don't know where you're at today. Maybe you're at the mountain. Maybe things are awesome and things are good. Good. Take stock of what God has done for you. Maybe you're in a valley and you're thinking to yourself, man, things just can't get any worse than this. We'll take stock of what God has done for you. Take stock of how God has been with you even through those difficult times. You see, Elijah lived his life for God even through the hills and the valleys, and that all started with his commitment to follow God. That's what he says, I am committed to you, God. Day one, I have to confront this crazy king. And now they're all trying to kill me. And yes, I've seen you do amazing things. And so through the good and the bad, God, I am going to follow you. And for us to be able to get through those hills and valleys, it starts with our commitment to God. It starts with us saying, God, I'm going to follow you no matter what. And God will be there with us through those hills and the valleys. We have to accept his leadership in our lives. We have to get on base with him. And that means we make Jesus the boss and Savior of our life. Let me explain what base means. Getting on base means this, that we believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. A is to admit that I'm a sinner and I need a Savior. S is surrender and say, God, you're in charge of every area of my life. And E is to express that in Christian baptism. And when we do that, our God is with us through the hills and through the valleys. And we can know and understand God's provision in every part of our life. I know many here have already made that decision. Many here have already gotten on base with God. And you have seen God provide in the difficult and in the awesome moments. I know you've seen that. So here's our mission for this week. If you've already made the decision to get on base with God, here's our mission for the week. I want you to take stock and think about, maybe you write it down, maybe you do it mentally, of how God works. How God has worked in your life, how he has provided for you. Because I don't know about you, but whenever I'm on the mountain, I'm thinking, God is providing. God is awesome. God is so good. And then when bad things happen, I think, God, where did you go? Don't you care? Why is this happening? Where are you at? And the reality is I think about it, and when I look at it and I really focus, I realize God did a lot more for me in the valleys than he did when I was on the mountain. And I begin to start looking at all the small things that God has taken care of, and I realize, yeah, I'm in this valley, but God took care of this, and God took care of this, and God provided this. I think it's the same for all of us. So this week, I want to encourage you think about how God has been there and provided for you even through the valleys, even through the difficult part. You see, God was there and he took care of us so that we could get up and get going again just like Elijah. And I want you to know, if you're in a valley today, there is hope. There is hope. God has an amazing plan for you, and it all starts with getting on base with him so that you know the one true God, the God who sent fire down on the altar, the God who provided for Elijah, and the God who can provide and take care of you as well. And it all starts with understanding God's provision in our life. Here's the thing. If you don't get anything else today, this last thing I'm going to say is what I want you to take home with. We have a God who is with us through the highs and through the lows. We have a God who is a God of the mountains and a God of the valleys. And the way that we can see that is when we understand that God's provision in our life and how he has taken care of us time and time again. And I'm so thankful that we have a God like that. And I hope and I pray that you know the God of the hills and of the valleys.